the town of Silent Hill doesn't play the role of a sadistic tormentor, but rather the most twisted therapist in all of fiction. The common analysis of Silent Hill 2 is that the titular town plays the role of an eldritch executioner summoning the guilty for their penance. But the game reads far better as the story of someone who's lost his ability to feel anything at all, and what happens when he's dragged to the one place that literally forces his emotions to the surface. James Sunderland traverses Silent Hill with an eerie composure. Despite the gruesome imagery and perverse creatures that surround him, he reacts with all the emotional intensity of someone stuck in traffic. This aspect of his character has been rightly praised as it sells his detachment from reality in the wake of his unforgivable sin. However, that interpretation clashes with another widely assumed theory about Silent Hill 2, that the core theme of the game is guilt, and that the town acts as a torturer casting judgment on the wicked. Because if we accept that the town plays the role of a circle of hell, it does an awful job of tormenting its victims, as shown by James's lack of fear. And I've always had a problem with that analysis, because it's far too comprehensible for whatever entity lies beneath Silent Hill. I mean, we all know that this town was built on a spiritual hotspot and was corrupted by the cult. But for something that to this day has no canon name, history, or even religion of origin, fictitious or otherwise, something about the notion that it's corruptible by mortals feels too understandable. And the fact that it's adopted the extremely human trait of malice is also contested within Silent Hill 2 itself by Laura, who, unlike the other denizens, isn't plagued by any kind of phantasm because she apparently has no trauma to manifest. But I find it hard to believe that the orphan that lived in a hospital, whose sole connection and surrogate mother just died, has no material for psychological warfare. Either the town of Silent Hill is sorely lacking in its imagination, which we all know isn't true, or it's not strictly malevolent, and prescribing some kind of motivation to it is akin to asking why the void bothers to answer when we scream into it. The problem with this framework is that it assumes James understands what he did and feels guilty about it. Because if we go with the standard interpretation of punishment, then we assume that James was purposefully lying to himself the entire time about Mary's fate, and the town was attempting to viciously dismantle the carefully constructed psychological reality he used to escape his guilt. But James never reacts to the terror as someone racked with guilt would. He reacts as someone without the emotional vocabulary to understand what's happening to him. I can't speak for anyone else, and I certainly don't want to imply I've experienced anything as remotely traumatic as James, but as an autistic child, my response to overstimulation or stress at school was to curl up into a ball until my parents came and got me. Because I didn't know how to communicate, process, or recognize what I was feeling, my mind and body just closed up and tried to feel as little as possible. Someone consumed with guilt would flinch at reminders of their crime, avoiding triggers and having an emotional breakdown when confronted. James never reacts like this. The voice in his head reads Mary's letter with a clinical detachment. He meets Angela, an abuse survivor whose trauma should conjure anguish over what he did to his wife, and registers her with mild curiosity. Most damning of all, when he's confronted with the literal spectre of his victim, he's able to continue functioning, whereas all but the most soulless of killers would be rendered catatonic by such an event. This is because he feels no guilt over his actions, because he's completely disassociated himself from emotion due to the fact he's forgotten how to feel, and I suspect that this happened much earlier than you're imagining. In the opening seconds of the game, James does the unimaginable and touches his face after using a public bathroom. This, as many others have identified, is him checking if he's real in some kind of supernatural sense. This gesture is the first signal towards his disassociation, as nothing to make him doubt reality has occurred yet, but he still feels the need to give himself a physical sensation, because he's already arrived at the town too emotionally numb to feel anything. But it's not the slaying of his wife that caused him to lose his capacity for emotion. After all, spousal homicide can't be committed by someone with the ability to experience or recall love. I believe that just as Mary's wasting disease stripped the cells off her physical state, it also corroded James's emotional state. My evidence from this comes from the two distinct sources for James's life pre-Silent Hill, Mary's letter and the audio flashback in the hallway. From these sources, we know James regularly visited Mary in the hospital and performed all the external actions a devoted husband should. But the truth is more complex. Mary's letter expresses both love for her husband and sorrow for the painful reality that she became verbally abusive because her terminal illness made her feel powerless and angry, and those voices emerged through the hallway flashback where they echo through James's memory. James endured the dual suffering of watching the love of his life physically wither and emotionally deprave without any apparent emotional response, as when Mary verbally abuses him, his response is to leave the room rather than to express any kind of reaction. And not because he was strong, but because I'm certain that the easiest response to such devastation would be to shut down your ability to feel. As such, he's unable to recognize his mounting resentment, identify his caregiver burnout, or, as the game itself boldly focuses on, his sexual frustration. If I've caught you off guard with that statement, then it's widely accepted that the fleshy nature of the enemies in Silent Hill 2 reflect James's unprocessed sexual desires, be it the fetishized outfit of the nurses, which he most likely fantasized on his frequent visits, or the introduction of Pyramid Head, where he seemingly rapes an enemy type known as a mannequin. Now, where you might react to those revelations with disgust for James and his psyche, it's important to remember that, by default, sexual desire isn't shameful, frustration at an abusive partner, even a dying one, isn't evil, and wanting your life back from the exhaustion of being a caregiver isn't selfish. And it bears repeating because I cannot emphasize this enough. By default, the way these emotions become toxic is when you're unable to recognize, examine, and integrate them with your other emotions. James experienced all three simultaneously and had no emotional capacity to process them. His weary psyche couldn't balance the concepts of, I love my wife, I hate my wife, and I want to fuck my wife all at once. And so something had to break. He killed her because his decayed psyche could no longer distinguish between ending her pain and ending his pain, unable to detangle his compassion and selfishness. His method of murder, pillow suffocation, is emblematic of how he's smothered his own mentality. As such, he lacks the visceral hatred an act like strangulation requires. So if even before James murders his wife, he's already emotionally crippled, doesn't the fabrication of reality seem more like a response to a mind unable to understand what it's done, rather than one consciously trying to erase what it did? And so we arrive at the letter that beckons him to their special place. Was this the supernatural invitation of the town once it sensed James's inhumanity, or is it his subconscious guiding him towards the only possible resolution, a brutal education on emotion? This is James's humanity fighting back, trying to show this machine that living in denial could only lead to suicide. And so his repressed emotions guide him to a place where they're able to externalize into perceptible forms. As instead of viewing it as a tormentor that revels in its inhabitants' despair, we can draw a framework for the town acting as a kind of morbid therapist. Unlike most horror games, Silent Hill 2's beginning is almost tranquil. There's a disturbed romanticism to traversing the serene streets without the possibility of enemy encounters. It's certainly not a reassuring atmosphere, as there's a sense of anxiety in the background due to the unexplained abandonment, but it's nowhere near as intense as its predecessor's downright traumatic opening set piece. This is the town showcasing a sort of manageable anxiety for James to accumulate to. What's brilliant is that for the player, it doubles as a tension builder, because unlike James, we know that this is a horror game, and so we're aware of the fact that the shoe could drop at any moment. And it most certainly does once we arrive at the Woodside Apartments, which forces James into cramped spaces filled with locked doors and perplexing puzzles, which is a parallel to his final months with Mary, trapped in their relationship, trying medicine that doesn't work and navigating an impossible situation. And so the apartment's lesson in his emotional education is to distinguish frustration and love as separate emotions. Of course, this area also marks the first manifestation of Pyramid Head, who appears behind bars. Now, I know someone out there has been screaming at the screen since I said Silent Hill 2 wasn't about guilt, as the common interpretation of this figure is that he represents as James's guilt and his desire to be punished for his sins. Now, I'm not going to deny that stance because it's too thematically perfect, but I'd also like to remind you that I'm not trying to contest what he represents, but instead what his intentions are. So while Pyramid Head is absolutely a manifestation of James's desire for punishment, I believe his role is an educator in James's emotional literacy so he can understand what he represents. And that initial appearance, standing docile behind the prison bars, is an indication of the cell James has formed that contains the desire for judgment, until it eventually becomes so apparent and overwhelming it literally doubles. And what's James's response to his perceived tormentor once he's faced the undeniable truth of what he's done? Quote, "I was weak, that's why I needed you, but that's all over now. I know the truth," suggesting that the figure has served his role in James's traumatic curriculum. The hospital is where Mary spent her final days, where James truly began to understand his powerlessness. The manifestation of his sins in this area is the nurses, these sexualized and grotesque figures that hunt him with a predatory intent. Now, the common interpretation is that these are a representation of James's perverted desires. But as far as we know, James never acted on these thoughts and cheated on his wife, meaning if we're going to be accurate, they actually represent his shame over those sexual thoughts. Now, sexual desire doesn't make him a monster. Acting on it certainly would, but the thought itself is morally neutral. And his stunted emotional psyche can no longer separate between feeling something and doing something, resulting in intense shame. So what's Brookhaven's method of teaching? For much of this section, Maria lies down in the hospital room and James can optionally check on her. However, the game is secretly tracking how attentive he is of her, feeding into his final grade. So the same location that spawns enemies built from his sexual frustration also allows him to practice a more caring relationship with a woman who bears the visage of his victim, which suggests that the issue isn't desire itself, but how he chooses to treat the object of that desire. It's important to note I'm not being literal. Unlike the culmination of the hospital level, in which the fantasized version of James slays his wife once again, its purpose for doing so is to refamiliarize the corporeal James with the emotions of grief, but removing the elements of guilt so his fractured psyche doesn't repress the pain of loss this time. Our next professor, Toluca Prison, followed up on what Pyramid Head was trying to teach. This location is undeniably filled with images of punishment, the most explicit being the Hangman's Noose puzzle, but I don't accept that the town is trying to tell him that he needs to accept self-flagellation as a truth, rather an emotion he can analyze. My evidence is this section's final test, Eddie, a character that has completely merged with his punitive worldview that everyone hates him and is disgusted by his presence. He accepts this narrative without pushback and uses it as a way to justify his violence. And despite being enveloped by all this imagery and logic of deserved punishment, James doesn't accept it, as he, of his own volition, opposes and kills a character who embodies the belief of self-flagellation taken to the extreme. Eddie, and by extension the town, explicitly tempts him by drawing the comparison between the two, yet through his education, James is able to recognize the emotion of unquestioning guilt and is able to wholly reject it. And so we arrive at the final exam, Lakeview Hotel, the location where James and Mary celebrated their anniversary. And it now forces contradictory emotions on him as his happy memories are laid over his current horror. This is the game's emotional crescendo because it's this building where James either integrates everything he's learned over the horrific events of the past 24 hours, or he fragments completely as the emotionally numb machine splinters into scrap. The Leave ending is the one where he passes his test with flying colors, as he's able to understand his complex emotional state, one of guilt, love, resentment, and grief, as one that's entirely valid, and he absorbs the messages in Mary's letter and is able to move on. He does this while taking Laura, showcasing he can accept responsibility for another person and their well-being despite his own past failures. In this ending, he displays that he's become someone who's learned to name his emotions, reckon with his contradictory feelings, and make moral decisions from a place of emotional awareness. That's not to say he's overcome the immense trauma or forgiven himself for what he's done, it's inexcusable, but he's regained his emotional literacy and he's using that knowledge to build something better. This was the ending I got on my first playthrough, and it just didn't feel satisfying under the guilty interpretation. As if I'm playing as a wife murderer who's dealt with his guilt, why in God's name am I leaving intact with a child? But under the emotional rehabilitation analysis, the ending feels far more thematically appropriate, given that he's recovered his ability to love. The In Water ending also demonstrates James has regained his emotional awareness and can recognize everything he felt and did, and is able to understand the complexity of his motivations. but he arrives at the incorrect conclusion that he deserves to die for them. What this ending demonstrates is that emotional literacy isn't enough on its own. You also require self-compassion. You could say that James mastered his vocabulary, but not his grammar. As he can identify shame, but can't separate himself from it. To me, this is the most tragic ending, as he regains his emotional awareness, only to weaponize it against himself. The Maria ending represents a fundamental failure on every level, as James learns nothing and chooses the fantasy over reality, as he accepts the illusion of his wife with no complexity to her and walks away. This failure is showcased through the final moment with Maria coughing, the same early symptom that Mary displayed. This is the town communicating that he'll repeat the entire cycle, that this relationship will also end in violence as he still can't process his emotions. As such, this ending depicts the horror of someone refusing emotional maturity even when his psyche literally manifested before him. He had his every emotion thrust before his eyes, and he still chose deliberate illiteracy. In the Rebirth ending, James collects occult items under the belief his wife can be resurrected, which shows that he's learned just enough about his emotions to be dangerous. Because instead of using his newfound understanding to move forwards with his life, he chooses to regress, channeling those feelings into supernatural denial. The ending's ambiguity of not showing us if the ritual works is a reflection of the ambiguity of emotional avoidance. Because in the moment, it feels like you're achieving something productive, but what you're actually doing is preventing real healing. The dog and UFO endings, stay with me on this, acknowledge that sometimes our emotions defy rationality. A dog masterminding the events or aliens abducting you carries with it the same logic as James's response to not being able to carry both his and Mary's suffering. It's why many players regard James as deserving of his torment in Silent Hill, because he's committed an act so inhuman it defies our understanding. And so these endings function as the game's admittance that even with full emotional literacy, human behavior is not bound by logical sense. Sometimes we make impulsive, indefensible decisions. Sometimes we're powerless against the chaotic maelstroms of our own psyches, and sometimes a dog runs the universe. So is James Sunderland a truly evil person? No, he's not evil. He's just catastrophically emotionally stunted. Now, that's not to say he isn't guilty. He should absolutely be put into a mental institution even in the Leave ending, as there still needs to be justice for his crime. But the killing wasn't a premeditated act of villainy he'd been plotting for months. It was the inevitable result of a man numbed of his emotions, put into an impossible situation. Just to emphasize the point so I'm not misunderstood, this doesn't excuse murder or redeem him, but it does recontextualize the town of Silent Hill as a perturbed force of rehabilitation rather than a malevolent entity. Emotional literacy has attained a cultural relevance in ways it could never be expressed when the game was released on September 24, 2001, as society couldn't have known how their raw psychological wounds would eventually fester. In the decades since, people discussed their responses to trauma, styles of attachment, and emotional regulation far more openly, as now we collectively recognize that many of us, especially emotionally repressed men, navigate through life with the emotional understanding of a child. James depicts that crisis taken to its logical extreme, showcasing what happens when emotional illiteracy meets an impossible situation, which is why Silent Hill 2 has culturally endured far longer than its franchise contemporaries, because we've now acknowledged that teaching people to identify and process their feelings is an essential survival skill in 2026. This also reflects a change in the game's perception. In 2001, when using therapy speak like I've been doing would get me beaten up on the playground, Silent Hill 2 was seen as a more deeply morbid and depressive game. It most certainly still is, but as society has become more attuned to the monsters living inside their heads, having them externalized is a far more visceral horror. So then it only made sense for this game to be remade in the modern era by Bloober Team, and although you've only been seeing footage from the remake, that was for your viewing pleasure. In truth, I've been discussing the original all along. However, Bloober made a controversial change to many, and that's the addition of a more visibly emotive protagonist, complete with voice breaks and facial expressions. While purists argue that this undermines the disassociative emptiness of the original, and it certainly throws a wrench into my thesis, I feel as though I should remind them that this stilted voice acting was almost certainly not an intentional artistic decision by Team Silent, as while this criticism hasn't held any weight for over a decade, There is a reason the saddest millennial you know is still banging the drum about how dubs suck, and Silent Hill 2 is very much of the era where localization wasn't taken as seriously as it is today. Though I'd argue that Remake James does a remarkable job conveying the obscurity of the fog in his performance. And if the remake truly had as wooden a dialect as the original, then such a mechanical voice coming from such a lifelike model would cause players to disassociate from the game itself. And if there's one thing more critical to Silent Hill 2 than its voice acting, it's the all-consuming immersion. To sum it all up, James comes to Silent Hill emotionally illiterate, and in most cases leaves with at least a functional understanding of his emotions. If James experiences any kind of character growth over this nightmare, it wasn't that he should be punished for his sins, it's that he regains his sanity through the most traumatic curriculum imaginable, and so the lasting power of Silent Hill 2 comes from one uncomfortable truth. Most men experience their lives with James's level of emotional awareness, suppressing our feelings until they externalize in a destructive way, not as literal monsters, mind you, but as the shattering of bonds we once thought unbreakable, and in the worst possible scenario, as violence we vowed we'd never commit. And so Silent Hill 2 asks, what if those emotions fought back in the most horrific way imaginable, where you either rehabilitate or die? And so the town of Silent Hill becomes the teacher that none of us want, but many of us desperately need. For more Silent Hill 2 essays, here's one about the staircase scene. If this broader and slower kind of analysis is something you'd like to see more of on the channel, liking the video and subscribing genuinely helps me justify the additional time these projects require. Thank you so much for watching to the end.